Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session where we're going to talk about Jira schemas and workflows for AppSec and risk management. So if you kind of know some of my work, I've been using and defending the use of Jira for quite a long time. I want to caveat this that, in a good worldly maps model, you should always use the best of the technology you have available. There's lots of components sometimes that, can be done better with a third-party tool, a third-party system that you have, and that's always great, right? But what's very important that you can hyperlink this. So the key part here is to think in graphs and to think in workflows. So this is actually a follow-up, a whole bunch of these sessions that we've done. This is quite a good one done by Abbas, Chris, and Petra, right, in the last summit, where they talk about visualizing risks and graphs, and that actually shows the end result of this. And also, there's a whole bunch of sessions already in the Open Security Summit YouTube, where you can also see the integration and the multiple different ways that we've used Jira in the past and how we actually manage a lot of this. And this is a presentation I've done, I think, in 2016, but it showed a lot of the evolution in one of the past roles as CISO I've done, and that also had a huge amount of automation. So I want actually to start with a quick overview from this presentation here, which you can find the link over here. And it basically, I presented before. So you actually, I'm not sure I presented it here, but it has a couple of concepts that I really want to talk about. So the first one is just the workflow that I have in order to show you the graphs and the schemas I'm going to show in a second. So the first key concept here is that Jira kind of sucks, right, for graph visualization and for some of the advanced queries that you want to do, right? Even into 2022, right? There's still a huge amount of gaps on it, right? So what we've done from a workflow point of view, we actually use this great OAS project, which actually Sam, I think, just joined, and he was one of the guys that really convinced me in a pub one day to open source the whole thing, which I'm glad I did, right? So one of the things that's on OAS Security Bot, which it still needs a bit of love to document a bit how it works, but it's insanely powerful. And I'm going to show some more stuff on the ways this session. But basically, what we do here is it's actually a very common pattern that I really advise anybody who's thinking about consuming data from multiple vendors. It's really a powerful workflow, which is, most tools, it's very hard to query stuff. So what we do here is we take basically Jira that we treat as a graph database, which you can think of it as a hyperlinked security taxonomy, and we basically move it or basically have a copy of it in Elasticsearch. It's actually not very complicated to do. It's basically an event that goes from Jira to an API gateway who triggers a Lambda function, who basically gets the IDs of what has changed. You go to Jira, grab that, you pump it to Elastic. So basically, it got to the point where it's actually, it feels like real time. So basically, you make a change in Jira, by the time the page refresh, you got the data actually in Elastic. In fact, if you have Kibana loaded up, it almost like as the page refreshes with your change, you get the page in Elastic being updated, right, with the new value of what you just updated. But what's very powerful is that when you then query Jira, you don't query Jira because it also is very limited in how it can do queries. You query using, in this case, we're using Slack and Jupyter Notebooks to actually use a Lambda function who hits Elasticsearch. So you use Elasticsearch to query your data. And that's very important from a security and a workflow point of view. And then in here, you got a bunch of commands that you can use, which I've used to grab this. The most important are the links one and the graph expand that you can manipulate. And fundamentally what it does, it creates a hyperlinked, workflow. So in this case, you could see that if you want to talk about somebody about the risk to brand, then, why do we have a risk to brand? Well, because, we have individual, the trust can be affected. And then if the customer loses trust, for example, in the brand, then you can do some outward engagement. So this is a very simple example, but the point is that all of these ones is Jira tickets. In fact, if you look here, every one of these yellow boxes is a Jira ticket, and that's how they hyperlink to each other. So I don't need to talk about the workflow here, right? So what ends up happening is you want to create a schema, a Jira schema that represents how the business operates. So I'm going to show you a bunch of examples of schemas that we've used, but what's very important is that every organization is different. And it's kind of like in the graph environment, it's easy for you to adjust to the organization, allow a level of innovation to occur within the organization, then to try to shoehorn a particular risk taxonomy or a particular project. Because what is also very important is to start with places that you can move fast and you can basically almost gain traction in your schema. And then you basically build a culture of having to use Jira or Hyperlink in this kind of graph structure. So there's a great presentation actually by John Hose where he took this to complete a massive different level. This is some of the stuff he was mapping there. He was part of my team a while back, but you can see that what you're describing, for example, here is how a business operates. And I want to stress this again. What's very important is to represent how the business works today before you try to drive changes. Because in most organizations, this is done by spreadsheets or not done at all, or done in a very ad hoc environment, right? So you have, for example, that a business unit is funding a particular function, who is funding a team, who has a couple of capabilities, who then have processes which are governed by a policy. And then this team has roles. And then these persons, in this particular case, we actually were mapping a shared Gmail account. So you can start to see that I already can navigate from the account that we were tracking, because it was a specific one in a finance department. We will basically know that which users had access, which belong to which roles, who belong to which teams, who have which functions, and the business unit. In fact, what's not mapped here is that you also go and find the business owner and the key stakeholders, so you can say, hey, you own this risk. Now, this particular shared account, which is in this case actually a mailbox, and we mapped a bunch of facts that we know about it. This happens, this has access, there's these many controls, etc. The fact creates vulnerabilities, who creates risks, and then you map the risks that you have, and then you accept the risk, right? So this basically what you're doing here is you're recreating how the business actually operates, and then in a way you're mapping reality, right? So you could see that, for example, an IT system is made of actually an account who has a device, who's mapped an application, and then has APIs and data, right? So you start to connect the dots. The third parties, you have a partner who provides a service, who gives you technology, have a module, have a license. The project as a project who targets a customer, who's delivered by key results. So the project has outcomes, who map key results, who then you have tasks, and then subtasks, and then facts and decisions and questions. So this is quite cool, because so in some of the projects I've done in the past, we actually map our objectives and key results directly in Jira. Because the point of this is that if you're using a spreadsheet, you are using a graph database. It's just an insanely non-efficient, not easy to maintain, nightmare. The more you use it, the harder it becomes graph database, right? So, this is basically putting a spreadsheet in the kind of graph format, in this case, using Jira. So here's a really cool, simple example of using security policies to map and allow you to make fact-based decisions. So a policy is a freaking flat, sort of set of bullet points that don't go anywhere, right? And you cannot link it to the real world. In fact, we are now recently done, in the last couple of years, some really cool examples of doing, PCI compliance based on policies where everything was on Jira. We just finished a SOC 2, really cool project where we mapped everything in Jira, right? And it makes a massive difference because everything becomes hyperlinked. You know what you're doing things. So what you want to do is transform this, right, into something like this. So you could see that this policy here is now broken into individual systems. So you got a policy top level who has a policy for each of the areas. So in this case, user authentication, account management, etc., who then has a rule, and then you go in sub-level. So what you have now here is that each of these requirements is now an item that you can track. And then you can map, for example, your facts. I can do this. And then there's a vulnerability, who has a risk. So then you have a hyperlinked workflow in this particular example to say, well, if we have, if I basically have a policy here that I say, I need to be able to, capture, logins, but if I can log in without using SSH and I can log in without using root, then I'm actually have a vulnerability here who creates a risk, who breaks basically this. So then I can say I'm also breaking the policy. So the idea here is to map this into your current taxonomy, how you use it and how you operate. And then, and then you basically have context-specific projects, right? Which is super powerful. So you can see here that you have a project for facts, you have a project for policies, one for risk, one for security, the items, and then one for vulnerabilities, right? And then you map everything together. So you can see in a bit later on the presentation that we took this to a massive thing where we have probably 100 projects, right? And but what you do is you're basically connecting items. So you can see that this Jira item that has a story affects these particular IT assets who have these facts about it and these vulnerabilities, which relates to these particular risk teams who have this level of sophistication to exploit, available to threat actors who can cause this impact. So what you now have is very good data to understand why should I care about these vulnerabilities? Why should I care about this particular risk story, which is already an aggregation of a number of vulnerabilities? So this is, again, how you scale. And then this allows you to make really, really good decisions, right? And we also apply the same thing for projects, right? So you can see here we define a bunch of projects who have objectives and key results, and the projects will address these particular vulnerabilities. And then we have the tasks for it. And then if we connect, and I believe we even connect to the people who are doing it. So this allows you to have a very direct line or graph that connects from a project that you're doing to what is actually addressing, who cares about it, who are the stakeholders, how you map this. And to be honest, like, you can do all these in spreadsheets, but it's an insane thing to do, right? Or you don't do it, which is what happens in most organizations, which is why, if you go to most security teams and you say, who are the stakeholders for what you're doing right here, right? Sometimes that question is very hard to answer, right? So, in this case, we even did threat models using the Jupyter notebooks and the things where we were actually mapping the components that we are addressing and the vulnerabilities directly in the threat model. This was really cool. This was one of the best examples of a threat model that I've seen, because it really allowed us to map out the components, the paths that you were exploited, the risks, the vulnerabilities, the questions that we were asking to the threat modeling, the things that you had to accept, the tasks to do. And then when you come back and revisit it a bit later, it was a great way to understand it. So fundamentally, you data science your data, right? You data science your information and you map everything. And in this particular case, you make sure that, for example, when you assign somebody or a risk to be accepted by some member of the business, there's a direct line to the CEO. So you should be also tracking who that person reports and who that person reports to, because sometimes finding this in an organization is very hard. Like, who owns this system and who's responsible for this? And then when somebody takes over somebody else's role, you'd be able to say, hey, you now own this. These vulnerabilities are within your domain. And this is super important because you want to make sure that the security team also has pressure from those business owners to say, hey, you should be, fixing this for me, so that you can make sure there's a direct correlation between the parts of the business that want you to do something, the areas that you need to do something from a security point of view, which actually should be connected again to another business stakeholder, and the stuff that you actually have funded, which would always not be enough for all that needs to be done. So you need to make sure you have visibility so you can make these trade-offs, right? So key of these is the workflow. So one of the coolest things that you have in Jira, right, is this ability, and I thought I had a slide here, probably I took from here, which actually show that one of the coolest things in Jira is that you can treat it as a graph database. Because in a way, if you want to have a graph database, you need nodes and edges. So that's the node connects to the edges, right? So this risk is caused by this vulnerability, which is caused by that, it's caused by the system, we affects this, on that incident, etc. So one of the coolest things when I think about your nodes is that every node, that you have, basically you need to have a good description, you need to have a good summary, good description, you need to add metadata items, name value pairs, assign it to people, link it to different places, have a nice discussion thread about that particular node, and have other properties and even complex workflows. Guess what? A Jira ticket does that really well. You can build this with ServiceNow, you can build this with other things, but this kind of process here is done on top of Jira, because Jira also introduces a really cool thing called workflows. So you can see here, you can create specific workflows, for example, for risks and for vulnerabilities. So where you could say the risk, you validate it, you do a risk assessment, then you say, are we going to fix it or we not, right? And then, if you're not going to fix it, you need to accept it, and then you need to approve it, and then the risk approval can expire after a while, so it doesn't mean it disappear. You just say, hey, we approve it temporarily for a month, 2 months, 6 months, etc. Right? And this workflow is the most insane effective you can do, because it allows to bring a lot of rationality to how you think about risks. Right? And you can see that we map things like false positive, things you want to escalate, things that are blocked in particular areas. And then in this case, you have a risk workflow and a vuln workflow. And by the way, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or else I'll just keep going, right? So the vulnerability workflow in this case was a little bit simpler, because what we introduced in the vulnerability workflow was also the idea that, you allocate for fix, but what's very important, is that you have to put it in a sprint. So there's no point of somebody says, yeah, we're going to fix it. Yes, it's super important. If it doesn't get put into a sprint very quickly, it means it's not going to happen. And again, once it's in a sprint, it's not like on a backlog, pit of despair, is that when it's actually going to be, addressed by the team. Because if it's not going to go on a sprint that's going to do something in the next couple of weeks, then you basically have to accept it. That's what it is. Because risk acceptance is fundamentally you saying, I'm not going to do anything for this for a month or 2 months or a year. Right. And then, when you have the finish, you need to test it. Only after you test it, you should fix it. Ideally, the development brings down the test. Ideally, you have automated ways to test security vulnerabilities, which you should have developed maybe even on the validation workflow, right? And then, you put that process. And the other thing that's important when you build workflows in Jira is that you have to take into account, for example, cases where we can't reproduce, cases where it's duplicated, case where it's actually no longer a vulnerability because something else dealt with it, or false positives, etc. Or cases where you need to escalate or you need to block. And you can see that this one's here, anyone can do. This one's here, there's a kind of a sequence to get to them, right? It's very important that you don't get stuck, right? So it's very important that there's always a way to go back and forward, right, from these issues. So, and that's fundamentally, this is kind of how we think about this, where vulnerabilities are here. The vulnerabilities create, in this case, we call it R3s. In the crew, in the next batch of examples, we call it risk category 3 to 1. And then, but the idea, and I like to think in terms of why. If you have a vulnerability, and a vulnerability can have sub vulnerabilities too, right? If you have vulnerabilities, basically, you want to ask yourself a question: why does this matter? What's the problem? And eventually, you're going to hit kind of business descriptions or categories, and that becomes a risk, right? Then you ask, why does this risk make sense? Or why am I worried about this risk? And that creates another one, and eventually you're hitting the high level risk, which is the one that are basically the business risks. And that's the main areas that you can be reporting. And again, this thing is what makes sense for the company. Each company has different centers of gravity. Some companies are all about data, other companies are all about system, others all about availability, right? Every company will have a center of gravity. And this is, again, what you should be reporting to the top level. And the key objective in some of this is to create workflows and create data that allows you to create dashboards like this. And I really like this concept because it also gives you a one number, right, for the overall team or the company, but also individual teams. So what you have here, for example, is 6 areas that in this case we were reporting data, from employee awareness, incident response and detection, governance and oversight, secure application services, protect data, and protect the brand, right? And then what we did was we mapped each of these into the main areas of activities, each of those mapped to the risks that were had, the sub-risks, and then eventually the vulnerabilities. What allows you to do is that if you ever have a vulnerability and you have basically that question, why is this a problem and why should I do something about it? And who's funding this, you can go up in a way, in principle, all the way to your risk dashboard, right? So for example, like when the log4j vulnerability came along, if you're highly exposed, your top level risk dashboard should have changed, either because you can't detect it properly or because the security application now, the threat landscape just moved, etc. Because also it's important here to take into account things like threat actors and the impact of it, right? Because remember, the objective here is to make the business safe, not to make the business secure as an abstract thing. Of course, that for the areas that you care to make safe, they need to be secure to a level of the risk acceptance of the business, right? So, and this is actually a variation of that one, where here you can see that where you went. So you can see we got -1, which is why this is now, you went from there to there. But you can see that this risk is the same. That -6 there was up, and this could be lack of investment, could be all sorts of things that got better. And this one here shows the same data, but where the delta is. So you can see that in this case, we can see that this one improved, +3. This guy here stayed the same. This one has -1, he got worse. Because in a way, what you get here is this is overall business. This is the areas that you're working on. And again, this is a very powerful view because it allows you to understand where you're investing, what you're making better, what you're making worse, right? Because remember that sometimes depending on your investment, you can become worse in the future, right? Your risk profile might actually go up. A good example is there's a lot of activities that the security teams do that you need to do this amount of work just to keep the current level of security, right? If you stop the investment, then actually the risk goes higher, right? Because you now don't have, right, that capability. So it's very important when you do a new project, sometimes to understand, is this project actually going to increase my overall security practice? Because I've seen projects that, although they add, for example, a lot to incident response, they, for example, add a huge amount of problems to government oversight. So this is an interesting question where you go, are we sure that we want to do this project? Because although it brings some new things, it's actually making a bunch of other things red, right? So, and remember that this is not just security, it's of course other projects in the business, but sometimes our security products do make the business more insecure, right? Depends on how it's implemented, how it's done, how it's oversight, etc. So let's now move into some of the new stuff that I want to show you. And again, any questions, feel free to drop the chat or ask to be unmuted, and then we can just allow you to mute to speak. So cool. So what I want to now talk to you about is some of the stuff that I've been working okay, actually there's a good question here, right? So Omar is asking the question, and to Omar, I just if you want to just unmute yourself and we can talk a bit about this, because this is a really cool question, right? If you want to share your camera, if you can too. But so Omar's question is, I suppose the output data is as good as the input, right? Lots of businesses using Jira don't manage the tickets and what's entered, and a lot of junk built in, right, could screw this up, right? First of all, that's absolutely true, right? The key here, and what I like about this model is the point here is not to be dependent on your input being insanely good, is to allow your input to be improved over time so that it becomes very good, right? And that's a big question. So so does that make sense, Omar? Like, so it's very hard to get people to enter data very, very well, right? What you can do is create systems that promote good data entrance. In fact, some of the graph linkage is very interesting because if you link wrong, your data doesn't show in the graph, doesn't show where it's supposed to be.
All right. Yeah, because I think, part of the big challenge, as I sort of explained in my question, especially when you're in a large organizations where multiple teams, and you oftentimes have even big development teams, 50, 100, multiple streams, work streams, and projects or pods or whatever you want to call them. Then a lot of information goes into Jira, and you want this data, right? But then it's just a fear that, hey, what you're looking at is not quite right. But you're saying it's really taken a view over time, basically the improvements over time, rather than taking what the current view is as the absolute. Sorry, my son stepped in.
That's all right. No, look, absolutely, right? And in fact, right, I have kids too, right? It's the same way as you teach kids, right? How to read, how to write, how to, to be civilized, right? Is that it's the feedback loop that is very important, right? What's important is that you have a way to create the data. But the other thing that's very important is to be able to give context, right? So one of the reasons why I like to have lots and lots of different Jira issue types and lots of links is because every issue type and every link type allows you to have context, right? Because if you have a massive pile of tasks, right? But some tasks are questions, other are actions, other are, maybe things, projects you want to link, etc. It becomes a massive salad, right? So you want to start refactoring it in order to get it to a good point. And the question is interesting, right? The next part of the question is, how do you get to the point where your Jira data is good? Well, it's good when you're using it, right? And you can present it, and the teams start to use it without you having to put a lot of energy to it, right? Which is why this doesn't work top down from a point of view of maintainability. But what I found is that you do need to have a team that initially kind of maybe a bit top down makes it work. And that's the key part here, right? And I guess when I show the projects, you probably get a better sense of how much of experimentation, right? I actually am defending, right? Because you probably think I'm defending this amount of experimentation, you'll see that it's actually probably that much, right? So to give you an idea, right? We use lots of projects, right? And actually, one of the things I found, in fact, the best clue that you have that you got a new model is when a new team member is introduced to the structure and it just makes sense for that person, right? It clicks, they get it, and they go, oh, okay, so if I put this ticket and I put that there and I map it out, then that goes over there and I know what I need to do, right? So it's almost like the less technical experience and the less almost domain experience you need to have to maintain the Jira ticket, the more efficient it is. That's how you know. So here's a subset. Actually, I think probably most of the projects that we have. And actually, it is interesting because we don't actually have a lot of business and team specific projects. What we have is, you can see we have projects. This is literally 99% or 98% of these were created by a security team in this particular case. Is you can see that we just about mapped everything that moves in the company, right? From actions to alerts to there's your typical backlog and bug. But we have business objectives, right? We have checklists, we have outcomes when we did our OKRs, we have contracts to track third-party contracts, we have cost centers. We even did a COVID project in the beginning when we were really treating it as a more custom incident, right? We got web domains that we want to track. We have facts, we have FAQ items, we have areas we want to focus. I think this was created by the team that were to track which employees liked what games, to even do a cultural thing, right? You've got GitHub users that we tracked here. You got the type of users, and this was, I think, was type of black hat that we were dealing with. We got a typical IT systems, and notice that for most of these we actually put little logos because it helps, again, little icons on it. We got milestones, outcomes. There's even guys from the IT team even tried to track some of the printers we had, right? Now, of course, some of these you can have a third-party system that manages it, right? The question was, what a challenge I gave to the team is that if you don't have another way to do it, put it here so that we can then track it, right? Again, GitHub repos that contain information. And like, this is an interesting example, right? Like, who owns a repo, right? Who maintains it? Who's responsible? Who has to provide the fixes? A lot of those things are not trivial questions, right? In most organizations. Now, some of these things, for example, are better managed by having a YAML file on the repo that contains that metadata, but sometimes you still need a way to link stuff. And the power here is because all of this is hyperlinked, once you add a new one, right, you get the benefits of the rest of the information, right? So just a couple more here. Now we've added here a lot of risk management. So in this case, we actually added the categories. And the reason we end up doing something like this is because, and you'll see, sometimes it helps when the project name, and you can see the project name here, right, actually already gives a context. So I know that if I'm looking at an issue type called risk cat 1-56, right, I know that it's a risk category 1, right? And I know that if I'm looking at risk cat 014, I know it's a, again, a risk category. If I'm looking at a particular vulnerability level, you go there, right? So some of these things help a lot, right? And you can see here on SOC, we got SOC to control, SOC to criteria, SOC to tasks, etc. So we created lots of issue types, and and the team experiment, right? There was even, I think, one here, they added the types of television we had, right? So the point of this is that this is what sometimes you want to see, because you let the team experiment, and then eventually, right, you arrive at a stability moment where you feel that you don't need to create new issue types. But my point is that if you don't have an easy ability to create issue types and link types, you're going to struggle, right? Because you don't have the ability to create the context that you need. So now let's look at schemas, right? So this is a view created by that workflow that I was describing, where the data, and that's the other thing I just want to mention, Omar. Jira is not the best place to search this data, right? I would argue that for most teams that use Jira effectively, you get an insane amount of value if you pump that data into Elastic and then use Kibana, right? Another place, another basically, actually the Blaze Kibana is pretty awesome, right? So to make visualizations out of it, that makes a massive difference, right? So what you're seeing here is the relationships between the issue types. And the thing that is super important, the other thing that we've done a lot was we basically use these issue links, right, as also a way to provide context. Because one of the issue links you have in Jira, which is horrible, is the relates to, right? Because the relates to doesn't give you any context, because each one is related to the other, right? So you need to make sure that you have this two-way relationship where you say, if I'm saying this role is a manager of this, then I have the opposite link type, which is this role, has manager that, right? So you can track the two levels, right? And what that allows you to do is to create queries that navigate the structure. Because if you don't do this, your graph very quickly explodes, right? And you don't get any context. So you basically are creating visualizations that follow basically this structure. So just give an idea of the kind of flows that we have. You have the role is a manager of another role, right? So this is a good example of a mistake, right? So when I was just basically using some random graphs that we had, this is also a great way to pick up an error, because clearly a role is not an access level of another role, right? Unless you're being very creative with the way you define roles, right, on this. But you can see that the role is assigned to a person, and the role as a business owner of a project, right? And basically owns that. So you start to understand these connections, right? So you can see here, the role is managed by, so here you can actually see the flow. So is manager of, so you can see the two, right? So so this is one where I started on here and I said, hey, give me all the issues. So you got the command is Jira links, roll 100, go down a level. So he basically went to this role and says, show me everything that is linked. Now, the next one is level 2, which is what this is 1, 2, and then that's 3, is what you see here is that I now get the reverse. So I see that the role is, one role is managed by, but if I go to that second level and I go, hey, show me your links, that will have a link back to the original one. So here you can see the pairs. So is manager of, is managed by, right? So you can see, for example, here, the role is, the project, right, in a way is owned by a role, and the role is owned by a project, right? And you can see that the project as a technical owner, right, this, or is technical owner of the project. So the cool thing of this is that once you got a project defined like this, you can now find, for example, who is the business owner and who that person reports to, and who that person reports to, etc. So you make sure that you get a very cool picture, right, that you understand this. And then in this case, for example, the project is affected by this risk category, right? Or, and this project has a product, right? Who actually has, again, that guy has a technical owner, right? So you can see that we now are tracking back our workflows. So for example, this role is assigned to this person who is assigned to this decision, Now, you could argue that the decision might be also better assigned to the role, because the role is the one that making the decision. So it depends again how you structure it, right? Your flows. So in here you have, in a kind of a microcosmos, you can see that we use this to make sure that from a product, I find the projects that affect the product, and I find the roles. I have the risk categories here that are created by the particular project, so I can map them through. I got a project is a collection of programs. So a program is a collection of projects who are then actually going to be mapped to an entity or a part of the business. And then you also can have features, because in this case, we actually were mapping the features because we were doing threat models connected to it. And then what you see here is if I go a level deep. So this is where, this is all schema. These are all relationships between our Jira issue types. And this is kind of what it should look like, right? Because you want to have some of these, and eventually you got some experimentation. But the cool thing is if you then visualize your graphs based on the good examples, your experimentations fade away, which is also quite cool. So let's look at a couple more examples here. Okay, so question for Sudhir: are these Jira projects available as templates? The projects don't have anything special, to be honest. Although I think one thing that I'll try to capture is that we also added some specific name value pairs. So I think you're right. I think that there's a project that we need to do to export them as Jira project templates. Most of them are reasonably simple because the name value pairs that you have there are almost name value pairs of what is the definition of that in that company. So again, I think you have to be careful not to bring too many things that make no sense in a particular company, right? So if you have a role, it's almost like, what do you currently capture on your role? Well, I guess the ones we capture are actually, we capture email, Jira IDs, Slack IDs, a bunch of other stuff, right? Even contacts and mobile numbers, etc. And that allows you to, again, already map that out. And then the projects depends on how you manage projects. The risks categories, again, is how you map that out. But that's a good point. I'll see if we can export some of these as templates, which will make it easy to import. So look at, here's a simple example, right? The role owns a project who has a top level risk. And actually, here's a good example, right? This is a mistake, right? Because you don't need this line, right? So this is one of the coolest things that you get when you graph the data like this, is that you find mistakes in Jira. In fact, you become much more comfortable making changes in Jira because you are not losing tickets. So when people sometimes look at this and going, well, it's very easy to lose tickets in Jira. Well, it's already easy today, right? If you don't put it in the right place, or you end up using Kanban boards that become unusable, right, after a while. So this is a much more powerful way to track this, and then you use your Kanban board almost to manage the workflow with the Jira tickets. So here's one example. Here's a bit more. Here's now the showing you the kind of the two-way conversation, right? So you can see that the role owns a project. The project creates in a way. So the risk category is created by this project. So and then that's the flow. So the risk category 1 creates the 2 is created. So the risk category 1 is created. I actually think that the arrows here should probably be the other way around, because you actually I feel that I just think that the arrows here are probably added not in the correct way, because the project creates the risk category 1, right? And in fact, the project should be creating the risk category 4, who creates the 3, who creates that is correct. So the risk category 4 creates the 3 creates the 2 creates the 1, right? So actually in this case, this guy should be linking kind of further down here, unless we're saying that all of these 2, 3, and 4s are created by this, which could be, right? So, this is where it now becomes a convention, right? So in order to read this correctly, if this project does create this category 1, and it should be that way, not this way, right? Then what you actually have is basically the flow of basically all of these risks here. You can see the risk is created by are part of that one. So the nice thing of when you do hyperlinks is that you can find what is the most effective place to link. So it might not be effective to link this project to every single risk category 4, because you might have 10 over there or 20. You might go, well, my 20 risk cat 4s create maybe 7 cat 3s, maybe create 3 cat 2s, maybe create 1 cat 1. Can I link to the top? As long as you inherit all of them, that works, right? And that's the sweet part of the graph, right? That you can then create. I think I know why the team created this, is they actually were trying to reuse this. So I would argue here, because you also want to be consistent, right? So you can see this, creates that, creates that. I would argue that, this also needs to read in English. So I would say that, the risk category doesn't create the project, right? And then, okay, maybe from an interpretation, the project was created by the risk, but I would actually argue that the project should be fixing that, right? Or should be reducing the risk of this. And that's kind of the power here, right? The power is that you should be able to describe in English how your organization actually behaves, right? So let's look at this. So you could see here that you got a risk reg 2, right? Who has, who basically, as a top level risk of the project, right? And see, so here's a good example of this is right? That feels more the other way around, right? But you can see that I can go to my risk for my risk registry, right? And I can find the technical owner, right? I can find the business owner. And that's very important, right? Because I can then know, right, who to talk to, who to take ownership, because you want to make sure that whoever's assigned that role is accepting or taking ownership for this particular risk that you have here, right? So this is just a variation, I think, of what we covered, right? So this is now the vulnerability, right? So this is an interesting one from vulnerability. So I like to draw the line between vulnerabilities and risk, where vulnerabilities should be very fact driven. So vulnerabilities should be something that is actually real. Like, for example, this system is vulnerable to for example, to log4j, right? Or this particular APIs is vulnerable to log4j. Then you might have a parent vulnerability or even a parent risk that starts talking about why that is a problem, right? In fact, you could even have other subset vulnerability to aggregate that. The point is that if you basically, sorry, I think, all right, cool. So I think my network went down a little bit. I think I should be back now, right? Cool. So, so what you have here, right, is that I like to think of vulnerabilities as very fact-driven, and risks are the whys. So you want to basically think about, if I say, okay, I got, this particular web app is vulnerable to log4j, right? And you should kind of start a bit lower, because it should be, this particular component is vulnerable, which basically means this app is vulnerable, right? Then you should say, well, why is this a problem? Then you go, well, because I can do remote code execution on a server. That's cool, right? So that's a capability. Now you should say, why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem because I can then access data I'm not supposed to access, right? Now that's cool. And then why is that a problem? Because now we have compliance issues. Now we're having, user identity access management issues. And now you can see that we're now starting to touch on high level risks, high level, basically items that you're going to have across the business, but you want to report on those. So that's kind of how I see it. The vulnerabilities are very facts. They should be provable. They need to be proved from a practical point of view, and they should be tested, right? And if you can test it, that means you're missing a capability, but they should be very pragmatic. The risks are the whys. Why I care about this, why I care about that, I care about that. Although it's also powerful to ask the question downstream. You say, well, we have a problem with identity access management or data being compromised. Why is that? Well, you go, well, because this happens. Why is that? Because this. Why is that? And eventually you hit vulnerabilities, and you can still keep going down. But there's nothing wrong with having 3, 4, 5 levels of risk and 3, 4, 5 levels of vulnerabilities. Ultimately, you have this pyramid that is your risk matrix. But what this means, it means that there's a direct connection between a vulnerability or an item that you care about and the top level risks that you need to present. And because you're going to make decisions based on risk, not based on the vulnerability. And that's when I say that our job is not to make the business secure, but to make it safe, is that if you connect your assets and what the business cares about to these top level items, you should be able to say, is this vulnerability going to touch those? So if you have a vulnerability over here that doesn't touch on a critical asset, doesn't touch on something that's super important, right? It doesn't have a threat actor that you currently care about, or you can do something about, then, you would argue that that's, and that is all falls into the risk acceptance mode that you have, then, you should not put a lot of effort into it. Cool. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a good sense, right, of a lot of these workflows, right? So a lot of these schemas. So when I want to, and this again needs to be built, and I'll do another session over the next summit where we go into more details into some of these, right? I just want to quickly now cover workflows. So it's very important that you create workflows that make sense for the business, right? So here are some workflows that, you can see this was actually a fact for an incident response, these different types of workflows that we created, a workflow to manage an NDA, a workflow even for budget items, in this case, even a GDPR question and policy reviews, right? So in this particular case, you have, very effective workflows. So let me just walk you through some of these workflows that you have here. And some of these are simple, some of these are a bit more hardcore, right? So let me show you this. So this is an FAQ, which is actually very simple, right? But it just allowed us to track, right, this workflow. So just give me a second. I'm just going to change my network here. Better. All right. Okay. Just give me a second. All right, cool. So this should now work better. Cool. Right. So let me just go to a couple of simple workflows, right? So this is a very simple one, but already very powerful, right? Where the workflow gets created. And remember that you can then do Kanban boards on this, right? So we just track, in this case, the FAQ, right? A question, right? How have we tracked it? How have we actually done it, right? This is a more interesting one where we do for questions. So, I really like questions, right, to be used on security incidents. The FAQ is a little bit different because that was actually used to create, I think was Playbooks or even something else, right? But the question in this case is that you start to capture the multiple parts of it from, have we even asked the question? Is it not a question? Have we not answered the question? And by the way, the reason this is green is because Jira, at least last time I tried, didn't allow you to change the colors of the final state. Ideally, this would be red, right? Because it's not answered. So the one thing that's very important is that, you want to be very trigger happy when you create items, but you want to make sure that you're also very trigger happy to get rid of them. So this particular situation, yes, you want to capture the questions very effectively, but you want to be very brutal in terms of, I couldn't answer it, or that's not a question, right? Or, it's blocked, right? Or you need more details in order to answer that. So you could see that what's cool about this is you start to put context into the question. So you don't just have a list of questions. For example, doing an incident, you start to have this flow where you go, well, look, I need more details about it, or I was not able to answer it. So, and that's important, right? It's important, the questions that you're not able to answer can actually be as important as the questions that you're able to answer, especially during an incident, because every question that you cannot answer effectively shows a gap in your processes. And that's super important, right? So here's an example of the statement of work, right? And this was actually, we were, working on a project where we had a very specific items that we do. So you could see, we basically were tracking the process, where to design it, do we had tests, we couldn't write tests about it, are we compliant, partially compliant, and eventually became compliant. So that becomes super powerful workflow, right? So this is one that we were mapping the threat actors. So and this is an interesting one where we actually we're basically saying when we have an actor that we actually cared about, we left it on these states. I probably would argue that, you probably want to have it, as a final state once you finish mapping it. But, it's, again, this is where culture becomes important, right? In terms of this. But we actually had Jira issues for the types of threat actors that we were using, which is quite cool, right? So this is what we call risk assessments and treatment, right? So you can see that in this particular case. And in this one, the team actually decided to make links to all. It just became easy. Sometimes I quite like that some states fall to the other, but it doesn't make the workflow sometimes a little bit harder to create, where you can see here that, you got the multiple stages, right? We got it live, you have to accept it, you need to transfer, you can mitigate, you can avoid, or you can temp accept it, right? In terms of that workflow. And remember that some of these is that this is a workflow for you to accept. So it doesn't mean that it's accepted, is waiting risk acceptance, right? So we basically want the stakeholder to accept this risk, right? And or here we're waiting for it to be mitigated, right? So this is basically the multiple stages that you have and makes your Jira workflows way more powerful in these flows. So in this case, it's a variation of kind of a simple, this is for the risk categories. So again, you can accept it, it could be live, you can mitigate it, avoid. And a lot of these also will have context in a particular organization. So, I don't think that a lot of these work well from organization to organization. I almost feel like the security team or the risk team should be driving this, right? Because they're the ones who know how they want to talk about these things. So this is a decision, and I really like the use of Jira for decisions, because it's amazing how many decisions are made in organizations that are not captured. And then, when stuff happens, it's very hard to map out who actually decided what, right? So you can see here that, on the decision, you started it, then you have the approval, do approve, do disapprove, but this is also so critical. More details needed, right? It's not a decision, right? Or are we tracking it? So you can see that these flows here, right? In fact, I just realized that this is actually deleted, right? Because this is the previous one. Probably what happened, there was a couple of questions that still have this workflow and the team didn't migrate it. But you have everything you need here. But this is super important, like more details needed, right? It means that the decision didn't have the stuff required, right? In fact, sometimes you have decision trees, which again scales quite nicely here, right? If you need multiple people to make decisions, you add them there, right? So you can basically implement it like this, right? So this was part of the SOW, the part of the SOC stuff that we were doing, where we mapped, and we need to think about it like from a compliance point of view, you need to provide evidence. So we created it. We basically said that we're waiting evidence, they verify it, and then we all good, and then we close it, right? So you got a nice loop of how we collect evidence for SOC 2. This is how we map. So this is an interesting one where this is about mapping business from a product point of view, the features that the team are working on, so that we can then track the threat models and track what we want to do about it, right? So we were starting to track what actually are the business working on, so we then know when we need to add security, but also when there's a vulnerability that got discovered, in a particular module, we know which team was doing and we know how to connect to it, right? This was when we actually were using, so the IT system is when we were basically using the Jira in this case to track, our systems, the vendors that we had, do you need to install it? How do you process? So this is a good example of, the IT team was actually using this, and then we benefited from a security point of view because we can link this to the other stuff they were doing, right? This is the one from where we mapped OKRs, objective and key results. So you can see that you can map an outcome, again, not an outcome. A lot of these sometimes are not very well written, needs more detail, super important, waiting approved, not approved, in progress, done and not done. So this was a good example of a sequence of events that you have an outcome, but even when you approve, right, it's not finished because you still need to do it, right? And then, and then you're done is when you finally completed your outcome. And the completion of the outcome should be made when your key results are completed, right? So it's a good example of mapping that out. This is what we did for policies. So we track our policies creation in Jira. This was again variation of the product. This was a project. So we track our projects, right? Again, the projects are very important because the projects are the activities that the team is doing, right? So we basically, it gets very meta because we created a Jira project to manage projects, right? That we do, right? But that's because I like this idea of everything you do ultimately, if it's bigger than a couple of epics, right, or big things, is a project, because a project should have a brief, should have a beginning, should have an ending, right, should have all sorts of, those sort of project management, should have a budget, should have a whole set of flows, right? So that's basically what you have here, right? And that's how we tracked it, right? And this is a variation of what we had before. And by the way, the slides will go online in a bit. And these are all, how we track tasks, which is also important, right? Because you can see that you can cancel, reject, approve, done, not done. I cannot underestimate how powerful the not done is, right? You have to be very careful to say, if you're not going to do something, if it's not realistic, if you're not going to be funded, or if you run out of time, you have to mark it as not done, right? Because the things that you don't do sometimes are as important as the things that you do. So this allows you to track that, right? And this is actually, so we kept going around on this because we call it vulnerable, depends how you want to slice. So this is basically the vulnerabilities, right? So this is how we tracked our vulnerabilities this is that of workflow I was showing you before, where you can accept it, not accept, false positive, allocate for fix. This is again the most important one that in sprint. So this means that it's actually being allocated somewhere, right? So final step that I just want to cover, playbooks, right? So one of the things that we do is we create our playbooks in Jira, and the playbooks are fundamentally a set of Jira questions that when we clone this playbook, right, we then answer these questions. So for example, like when the machine is compromised, you want to, these are all the questions, right, that you want to answer very quickly whenever a machine is being marked as compromised. And these are the tasks that you want the team to do. In fact, in this case, is actually trigger another playbook, right, that has a whole bunch of set of actions, right? So so that's a really cool way of doing playbooks, right? Because you have every question that you do, and then once a playbook is executed, you can go back and say, were those questions good? Were questions that we missed? Is there anything else we should have done? And that makes the next version of the playbook, right? Here's for phishing, again, what happens? How do we react? And then what are the tasks to do? I really like this one, create a diagram and infographic to map the security event, because sometimes this helps a lot for everybody to understand what's going on. And this is actually another really cool playbook, which is how we actually do threat models. So again, here are the questions that you want to ask, when you do a threat model, and here are the tasks that you want the teams to do, right? And this is how, again, we scale, because this allows somebody that, for example, doesn't have a lot of experience on threat model to take this, start following it up, but also allows the data to be reviewed, because you can then present this in a nice kind of way. And then, we also map this for third-party security compliance, right? So actually, this is actually a top level of the questions. We actually map these in subsections. But, again, we can track in this particular example, we track every question that we were basically doing in here, so we can make sure that we have the good data, etc. Now, there's some extra tools that, again, there's some servers out there to do this. Great, if you can do it, if you can link to it. But again, if you have Jira, this is a great way. And it shows the use of Jira at scale, because this was quite a complex, again, all these they would have been in freaking spreadsheets, right? So we actually did this super effectively, and it worked really, really well. And I think that's it. I know my presentations. I'm not sure there's any more questions. If not, ask the question. If not, the video will be available in a bit, and me and the team will do another session next in 2 months from now, where we'll try to zoom in on some of this. We present. I think I need to find a couple of good examples where you can actually see the Jira tickets, the flow, and then the schema around it, and that will kind of help to visualize a lot of this workflows. So that's it. Thank you very much.